Hey everyone, welcome to the Angst podcast. My name is Jericho. I am your host. Thank you so much for tuning in for today's episode. We're going to be having a conversation on monetary policy, specifically the stimulus package in response to the COVID-19 pandemic and kind of the response that we've seen by banks around the globe and just this crazy amount of money printing and policy changes that we have seen so far. In no way, shape, or form an economic policy maker or an expert. I don't have an economics degree. I mean, I'm not getting on camera right now and saying that I'm the guy that you have to listen to for your economics 101, but I am a functioning member of our society. I pay taxes, I have an income, I have a savings account, I play with money, and I have a couple of thoughts about the monetary policy, how things are set up. I have a few questions about where we go from here. I personally believe that this COVID-19 economic response is one of the biggest wealth transfers human beings have ever experienced. And I think it's really easy for people to, growing up or being born in this modern, technologically advanced age that we live in, I think it's really easy to forget that history is malleable and ever changing, and we're going through the motions, and we always look back on, oh, those individuals didn't understand, or they didn't have the technology, or we've gotten better, and we've kind of had this exponential or linear growth up to the right that we're constantly improving, and now things are sorted out, we're really getting there. And so with money, for example, I don't really find any of my peers or in my day-to-day conversations, I don't really come across people questioning the monetary system or the money supply. We are kind of born into this monopoly game of global trade, and we just assume that the experts have figured it out, that there's some type of authoritarian source. There's Harvard or Yale educated Ivy League economists and policymakers that are the right people that understand all of this complex and intense jargon and theory, and they're making decisions with you and I or the public or the nation or the world's best interests in mind. And I believe right now in 2020, this is one of the most obvious times to refute any of that authoritarian belief. I don't believe that these policymakers have your and I best interests in mind. I think they're taking advantage of a worldwide pandemic and a crisis, and I think that it's important that we, the people in the public, are having an open and honest discussion and giving a shit when it comes to how the global economy actually functions and how money actually functions. When COVID first started, especially back in like March and April, I think blinders came on for a lot of individuals, and part of those blinders came from the fear of dealing with a health crisis and a global health crisis. People are dying, and many or more are going to die. We need to respond accordingly. If we have to shut down the entire economy, that seems like a no-brainer because we're dealing with this health-focused crisis. As time's gone on, at least for me and my beliefs, I think it's become painfully obvious that this health crisis is nowhere near as bad as that original reaction or the legacy media kind of fear propaganda led us to believe. But I still see so many people kind of focusing in on the health crisis or the supply chain crisis, and very few people have actually pivoted to ask a couple questions about what were the policy changes or the economic impacts of just printing all of this money and bringing our economy to a halt. There are long-term consequences to this decision, and just because we don't see the immediate reactions reflected in our day-to-day lifestyle, that doesn't mean that they're not still coming down the road, and that doesn't mean that the money that's been created and pumped into the system to try to absorb the blow of the COVID pandemic isn't going to have to be paid back by you and I or our children or our grandchildren or our great-great-grandchildren. And so, again, prefacing, I'm not an expert. I do just want to break down a couple quick principles as I understand them about how our current global monetary system actually works. A few things we should know is that, one, the globe functions on a reserve currency, that is the US dollar. The dollar is always going to equal one or close to it, and all other currencies essentially function and fluctuate around this dollar. How did that come to be? Well, without getting into a massive history lesson, the short and sweet is it essentially came out of World War II, and World War I, kind of a couple combinations of factors. But it essentially is just relating to America's dominant military force. So before the global reserve currency was the American dollar, it was the British pound. And that just came from Britain having the strongest navy and being able to conquer the seas. And, the sun never sets on Britain's empire and all of these different things. But we've seen that transition now into the American dollar. And you best believe that there are countries around the world that are not a fan of the American dollar being the global reserve currency. It's obviously great living in the Western world, or being an American where you have this strong dollar. And part of that strength gives us this fallacy that we're living in some type of correctly accounted for economic system. That, our life is good enough, we're functioning at a high first world quality of life, and so there's no reason to question the system because the system seemingly works for us. And so why would I have to question my monopoly dollars or where the money comes from or how it works, because it seems to be working no problem. That is not true for all human beings around the globe. I mean, if you are growing up in Venezuela, Zimbabwe, if you were born in Argentina or just got a wrong roll of the dice and ended up in some type of corrupt or taken advantage of third world nation, then you have infinitely less confidence in this authoritarian regime that is going to actually take care of the monetary system and have the citizens' best interests in mind. We have a little bit of a veil covering our eyes because we live in this first world that has proven or given us enough confidence to feel like the system's working. But that doesn't mean it can't get taken advantage of or become corrupted. In fact, since they are the dominant forces, they're the ones that are actually taking all of the abuse. If corruption was ever going to seep into a system, it would seep into America because that's kind of the leader or the one in charge that we're trying to overthrow or overcome. And so if other nation states that are fighting to be the global reserve currency or just want to get rid of America as the global reserve currency, it would be in their best interest to try to shake loose the stability of that quality of life and that strong dollar. And so a couple just principles I want to make clear to everybody is that right now, the money that you and I use, this paper money, it doesn't mean dick. Like it's not based off of anything. Where money gets its value is the reinforcement of the nation that you're in. So it's this belief of all individuals that the nation is backing the money, that the nation is going to tax you in this money. So you're going to have to produce this money if you want to be a contributing member to the country, or if you want to have citizenship, you're going to have to pay taxes to be here. Those taxes are denominated in the dollar. So you best get yourself some dollars. And this is kind of this big circle jerk that we all just buy into. But money has evolved throughout the years. Like I said, the British pound used to be the global reserve currency. Gold used to be currency. Salt and cigarettes used to be currency. I mean, money is fluid. It isn't necessarily this one tangible thing. You see Bitcoin or cryptocurrencies trying to make a push into being money. But what do we mean by money? I mean, is money a medium of exchange? Like, is it something that allows you to buy assets? Is money a store of value? Is money energy or a representation of time or power? I mean, like time is money isn't a saying randomly. Like we know that what you're essentially doing is you're producing a certain amount of work that takes energy. You were then rewarded by the market, by your employer, or by the economy in some way, shape, or form, and you're rewarded with this paper currency. But it's not, the currency itself is just based off of this trust within the system. If the system became too corrupted, we would lose faith in this dollar. The worst part about the current system that we're in too is that the dollar isn't scarce. It's hard to come up with actually how many dollars exist in the system. We have rough estimates, but it's changing all the time. And COVID-19 in 2020 is a classic example where Congress, at least in America, but this has happened across the entire globe. This isn't unique to just being American. But world banks around the globe and nations around the globe had to react in some way, shape, or form, economically speaking, to support the citizens as they mandated economic shutdowns and stay-at-home policies. So they did this by printing money out of nothing. This is our current system, which is a fractional reserve banking system, working as it's designed to work. So this is the importance of this podcast and this video, is I am not calling out that anything illegal or what is going on here is a correct reaction based off of the rules of the system that we're currently in. And so if none of this is making sense, or if I'm not being clear right now, fractional reserve banking, if we rewind the clock hundreds of years, and let's say no banks exist, you've got some money, I've got some money, but we don't want to carry this money around with us all the time. It's cumbersome, it's kind of heavy, we could get robbed, so we're going to put it into a bank. And so when we put this money into a bank, they're going to hold on to it for us, and maybe they're going to give us a receipt or a piece of paper to represent holding on to our wealth, and then whenever we want to come back to the bank, we can hand them this piece of paper, and in theory they give the money back. But that's not how that's how banks maybe started, but as they went and evolved, they became a fractional reserve system. So what that means, and again, we'll use easy numbers. Let's say there's only one bank and two people. There's you, there's me, and there's our bank, okay? If you go into the bank and deposit $100, and I go into the bank and deposit $100, that means the bank has $200, okay? But the way that fractional reserve banking works is that hypothetically, instead of they'd then only be able to lend, actually, sorry, let's clarify something else. If they have that $200 held in the bank, then what the bank then realizes is, well, we've got all this money sitting around, maybe the money should be doing some work for us. And so they take the $200 and they lend that out to maybe an entrepreneur or somebody that wants to start a business, they need a loan of some kind, they give that $200 to that person. But right away you have an issue, because if I come back and want my $200, well, technically they've loaned out the $200. The extra part of the scam is that the bank itself is actually gaining interest and making money off of that loan. Well, shouldn't you and I be getting that interest, because it's actually our money that we've put into the vault? Now the bank has lent it out, so they're taking a risk using you and I's money, and yet they're gaining the interest payments, and we're actually paying the bank to hold on to it. So they're taking a risk with our money, and if anything goes wrong here, it's not really even the bank that gets caught holding the loan, it's you and I that ends up getting kind of fucked out of the deal. This would be your basic banking 101, but they've actually extrapolated this into the fractional reserve system. So now, instead of just being able to lend out $200, they create this debt or credit, if you will, based off of only having to hold 10% of what they loan out. So if they have $200 in their system, they can actually lend out 9 times as much, as long as they keep 10% of whatever all of their loans are out. So they could loan out $2,000. And as long as they have $200 sitting in reserves ready to go, this is perfectly legal and allowed for them to do. So it creates this ridiculous exponential growth on the system and weight on the system, where we're essentially lending out money that the bank doesn't have. And throughout human history, multiple nations have attempted this. America attempted it 3 different times before they got the Federal Reserve, which is currently their kind of nation bank, which is a nice tricky name to make you think that it somehow has America's best interests, or that it's a representative of the federal system, when it's actually not. It is a private bank set up by private bankers. But this system, now you could see kind of the liability of the risk. Economic policymakers or economic theory would say that the reason we can get away with this fractional reserve banking system is because there isn't really a tangible scenario where everybody would come in and try to recover their loans simultaneously. Although history says otherwise, because we've seen this happen multiple times with multiple crashes, including 2008. So only a decade ago, where all of a sudden all of these bad loans start defaulting because the banks have gotten greedier and greedier with their lending and their loans, and they've handed out more and more loans to individuals that maybe shouldn't have been approved in the first place. But it doesn't really matter, because the banks have achieved a too big to fail status. And so what that means is that the bankers themselves get signed off to function within the law system of America by Congress. And Congress backs the loans. In the event that everybody starts panicking and comes into the system and freaks out demanding their money, the response is that we're just going to have to print more money into the system to accommodate the need for everybody to come back, or to accommodate the need of everybody trying to pull money out simultaneously. And so we saw this in COVID, when all of a sudden the market starts to tank. Everybody's trying to buy back into dollars as a safe haven. They don't trust their assets. They don't trust the banks to hold on to them, or there's so much uncertainty up in the air that all of a sudden we have to print trillions of dollars to try to handle everybody that's going to miss their mortgage payments, all the landlords that aren't going to have rent next month, all of the businesses that aren't going to be able to pay rent next month. We have to essentially pump this thing full of helium or fake dollars to get it back to a functioning state. And this has been going on for 100 years. The Federal Reserve was enacted in 1913. They have done this multiple times, and every single time it's essentially the bankers are making money off of their loans and their interests. They are incentivized to make riskier loans and more loans with bigger money and run those reserves as low as they possibly can, because that's more profits for them. And even though this is a risky system, it doesn't matter, because if the system implodes, the government will have to react. The government can't be held with its dick in its hand, because all of a sudden there's a problem with the citizens, the banks all fail, and everybody loses their houses, their jobs, their life savings. All of a sudden you have a real world depression. We have gotten to this hyperinflated situation where that just can't happen. And so these policymakers have to just essentially create money out of nothing. They have to perform this type of alchemy to essentially keep our standard of living inflated to a fake level. And how long can this song and dance go on? In the meantime, all of these bankers that are getting handed trillions of dollars are just getting richer and richer. Asset prices inflate back up to all-time highs. We've seen this market dipped V-shaped recovery, and nobody is responsible. And I mean, it seems like on paper it seems so beautiful, because why should anybody get burned by this situation? COVID-19 wasn't anyone's fault. No mistakes were made. And so this is just a natural phenomenon. And so it's not fair that anybody has to deal with this crisis, or would have to go through this reset or some type of actual economic collapse. But isn't that just human nature? I mean, there's so much uncertainty in our day-to-day existence that I don't know where humans get this constant need, or they constantly demand control over the system. And so when the system starts to shake, or when Mother Nature throws us a curveball, human beings reject it and instead enforce their own beliefs or their own influence into the system. But this isn't healthy economic policy. This isn't supply and demand functioning in a way that would find an equilibrium or a balance. We just keep stacking dollars into the direction that we demand them to go. And eventually, this tower of money is going to get so unbelievably high and unstable that it has to come crashing down. And when it does, it's not going to be the bankers or the policymakers that are left without an income or without a life savings. It's going to be you and I, the common taxpayer, the individual that's going to be left footing the bill is the middle class. And I think we're starting to see tastes of that, and we're starting to get a bit of an awakening of that with the COVID stimulus policy that's come down the pipe. I don't think I have solutions to this problem, unfortunately. We are way too far along. The Federal Reserve, like I said, has been functioning for over 100 years, but the Bank of England and World Banks have been going for a lot longer than that. Fractional reserve banking has built up so much momentum that at this point, there's essentially no way of stopping it. And that manifests itself into bigger and bigger and bigger reliance on the state. And so what happens is these loans get sent out, the banks start to default, they don't have enough reserves, the government has to come in and pick up the tab, essentially printing money out of nothing and creating like treasury bills or IOUs. And they keep doing this over and over, which creates a larger government, because you have to subsidize all of these programs. And if you're going to make sure that, if you're going to have to pay for all of these businesses, or you're going to have to pay for all of these individuals that can't go to work throughout a health crisis, well, then all of a sudden, all of these individuals become reliant on the state. And then when you try to take that away later on, you get a ridiculous amount of pushback by the public, because there are people whose lives are being directly affected. Anytime you create a social program of any kind, you can never take it away. And people just keep demanding more. I mean, one of the examples, so I'm Canadian. When COVID first started, there was an $82 billion stimulus package that got approved essentially right away. So this was going to be to give a individualized payments to individuals who had lost their job due to COVID, and this was also going to be to try to supplement or aid businesses that were being forced to close by the government for an ongoing or undetermined amount of time. And so 82 billion comes out right away with more money to follow. At this point in time, Canada has now printed over $1 trillion, again out of nothing, using the Bank of Canada to just inflate our monetary reserves. And yet, we still see the government handing money in every single direction. So, I mean, Lebanon had a bombing. There was a fireworks explosion in Lebanon a little while back, and the Canadian government found $5 million in the middle of a global pandemic to hand away to Lebanon. Then, we've got this Black Lives Matter movement, and this kind of minorities deserve recognition in the market, in healthcare, in education, in entrepreneurship. And so the Canadian government finds another $221 million that they're going to hand to Black entrepreneurs. I'm not saying that ethically that isn't a beautiful idea, but in the tangible reality, where does that money come from? I mean, well, we're just printing it out of nowhere. And so if the government can just print money out of nowhere, why do we pay a tax? I mean, and we pay a lot of taxes, guys. Like, you get an income tax, you get a property tax, there's a natural gas tax, if you go buy cannabis is taxed through the roof here in Canada, and nobody gives a damn because it's a drug and it's seen as a luxury. So if you want to tax it at 30%, that seems totally fair to everyone. You have a sales tax, so if you buy anything, you're going to have to pay money on that. If you die and you have a will and you leave assets and capital to your children or to your family, the state will come in and there is a death tax as well, and they will take a good percentage of that. And then there is the worst tax of them all, which is the inflation tax. And this is the point of this entire conversation here today, guys, is that when they print money out of nothing, that diminishes your and I purchasing power. In theory, the way that our economic system has been built up is that they purposefully create inflation to incentivize economic growth. And so what do I mean by that? It's that if you have $10,000 sitting in an account, and you know that every year the money supply is increasing, so there is a 2 to 3% inflation. So if you have $10,000 in 2020, that doesn't mean you're going to have $10,000 worth of purchasing power 10 years from now, because as the government or as the private banks print more money into the system, your money or your piece of the pie starts to become smaller. And so realistically, the way that our Western economy is functioning is that there is an incentive to spend the money now. Because if you're going to just hold and hoard the money and just stuff it under your mattress or bury it in the backyard, when you come back to get it decades later, it's going to have diminished in its value. And so there's a natural incentive for commerce. There's a natural incentive to spend and to not hold too much in reserves and to have this money flowing throughout the economy. And again, policymakers that are in charge right now say that this is a great thing. That this is the nature of the economy. And we can even go one step further to say, all of this money that gets printed, which inherently comes with an interest rate. So when the Federal Reserve prints this $2 trillion, it's currently at a very, very low percent interest, but there is still interest. But as they continue to print money, as hundreds of years go on, eventually all of the money that's been created has interest on it. But how do you pay back money? How do you pay back interest on the money that you had to get printed to bail you out? You literally can't do it. If all of the debts across the entire world got paid off tomorrow, the money supply would disappear. There would be no dollars. They would get sucked back into bank vaults and computer algorithms, and it would equal negative. Like there is not enough money to pay back the nation's debt. And this is where the craziness of economic policy starts to come in, is that if you talk to Federal Reserve chairs, if you talk to Ivy League economy professors, they'll make an argument that we never have to pay this debt back, that we can just create and continue pumping money into the system over and over and over, and as long as we're just paying back the interest, that's good enough to maintain the system, that we don't actually ever have to pay back the debts that we create. I mean, if that's the case, again, I will reiterate, I don't understand why I have to pay tax on essentially every move I make. if I want to buy something or if money comes in my direction, why doesn't the government just print money it needs for its socio-economic policies, and I can just use my money for my own purposes? Like it starts to get convoluted. It starts to feel a little bit like this taxation is theft, because as they print more money, like I already said, that is the largest tax, but it's an invisible one. And so people constantly get paranoid with owning assets. People get very protective over their dollars. And so in a period like COVID, where there's a insecurity or a crash of some kind, everybody starts to sell. They sell their boat, they sell their beach house, they sell their stocks, because they're getting nervous that the economy is starting to crash and they would like to hoard dollars back into their system. But that's not necessarily the best way to handle the situation, because if you just buy up and scoop up a bunch of dollars, you get rid of all of your assets and hold them all in dollars, and then the government, you wake up tomorrow and they double the money supply, then all of a sudden all of your dollars that you just hoarded up are essentially useless. And you didn't have a say in that. Like, you just woke up to the policymakers making this decision. And so this leads me to the real point of the conversation, guys, that we are essentially living underneath a cartel of private bankers that are functioning within the legal system of our not nation, but like the laws are the same regardless of where you live. It doesn't matter if you're in England, it doesn't matter if you're in China, this is irrelevant if you're Canadian or an American. These world banks have their tentacles out into all nations around the globe. There are a few nations that haven't played as friendly, North Korea and Iran being just two examples to name a few, and they get treated accordingly as kind of this sub-layer of not necessarily a nation you would want to be in, a nation that gets a lot of hate and wars and negative energy thrown in their direction. And again, I'm not here to defend North Korea or Iran. That is a totally different topic of conversation. But these are examples of a few nations that don't play the global reserve World Bank game. And it shows. It shows that they're not in with the boys club and they're not playing with the bankers. All these other nations, including the ones that you and I live in, are entrapped into the system, where there are a group of usually rich white men, old white men, that you would never see Black Lives Matter protesting outside of these private banks. Those individuals are involved. They're unelected, they've been around for decades at a time, and they essentially influence the game of money and power and time and all of those things, energy that money represents. They're the actual policymakers, and they have the power to influence a game that you and I are trapped in. So another way of saying it is that there are the haves and the have-nots. There are the rulers and the ruled. And right now, I feel very much personally like one of the ruled. We are stuck within their system. If they chose to collapse the dollar, if they chose to print an infinite amount of money tomorrow, there's nothing that you and I could do to stop them. In fact, I think that this is going to continue. I think we're going to see more and more dramatic economic policy changes come into play. My solution or advice is to own gold, precious metals, land, Bitcoin. And none of these are perfect solutions, because the bank could come in and they could snatch up your gold. They could take away your land. We are 100% in their game. And that doesn't, to me, seem like the right way to do things. I think we need some type of decentralized system where policy decisions are not made based off of the emotional or the intellectual reactions of human beings. Human beings are imperfect creatures. Our interests do not all align. The interests of Americans do not align with the interests of the Chinese. The interests of the middle class do not align with the interests of the elites. And I don't think that it's fair to have a small subset of individuals running the system. If you guys have made it this far into the podcast, I'm going to go one layer deeper into conspiracy, because you're obviously along this ride with me, where I would like to even say that these private institutions like the Federal Reserve or the Bank of England or the Bank of Canada, these have actually been founded by private citizens like the Rothschilds, the Carnegies, the Rockefellers. JP Morgan was directly involved as a frontman, essentially, to help set up this private cartel system. And these are billionaires and trillionaires and people that have had a stranglehold on global economies that set up a private game where they could take all of the risk, or they could gain all of the profits without taking on the risk. The way that they did this was before fractional reserve banking actually existed, they built up large, large sums of private and individualized wealth. When nations across the globe ended up in wars with other countries, these private bankers or individuals would take their private wealth and essentially make loans to both sides. They would hedge their bets to whichever direction had more momentum, or to whichever politicians or policymakers they needed to make sure that everybody was bought and paid for and within their pockets. And they were able to fund these wars and perpetuate these wars to a point where that essentially became their business model. At this point in time, there are economic policymakers that believe that the only way to keep the economy functioning and prospering is to be in a state of perpetual conflict. There always has to be an enemy that we're striving to defeat. And so whether we point a finger at an individual nation or dictator, whether we just point it at something all-encompassing or large like terrorism or climate change, or maybe it's something like COVID. We're at war with this virus. We need to defeat the virus. And they use this propaganda style terminology to keep us in this perpetual state of money printing, that we have to spend money to deal with the issues, and that throwing money at the problem is essentially the only way that we're going to do this. And that creates this perpetual energy reserve for this creature or beast that just grows and grows and grows, and it takes over everything. So we essentially have too big to fail banks. We have a too big to fail government system that, essentially indoctrinates its citizens into demanding that everything is taken care of. They want free education. They want debt forgiveness. We need free healthcare. We need social programs for people with disabilities. We need economic policy changes for minorities. We need every single aspect of our society to be regulated by big brother states. And they also control the education systems and the economic policies from the top down. And so if you go into school wanting to become an economist, they're going to indoctrinate you with their belief structure to make you to validate that this system is the best way of doing things, and that anybody that pushes back or tries to change it is never going to gain enough political recognition or power influence to actually be able to destabilize the current game. So you either join the boys club or you get rejected by the system and you'll never actually amount to a position that would actually give you enough power or influence to change. So we are in a crossroads as humanity where the powers that be are not going to let go of the reins. They are demanding more and more power by the second, and they use fear and propaganda as a way to essentially sink their claws deeper into essentially you or I, or into the stranglehold that they have on the populace or the individuals of the nation, the citizens of any given nation. And they don't play by these aren't patriots. They don't care about individualized nations. If they have to sacrifice the American dollar and move it into some type of global reserve currency, if they move it to the yen, if they create some type of conglomerate between English-speaking white nations like New Zealand, Britain, Canada, America, and we see this congregation of money, it's irrelevant for the bankers because they've hedged their bets into these countries around the globe. And so right now, I think that we're currently witnessing a little bit of a sacrifice of America. I see insane amounts of political divide, whether it's race wars, whether it's left versus right. There seems to be kind of this underlining narrative that the system is corrupt, that we need to burn it down, that we need to give more power to policymakers because for some weird reason we believe that they have our best interests in mind, or that they've proven themselves to actually take care of us, which I think is the opposite from true. But I think that this is years of indoctrination through the educational system, and it's been slowly orchestrated by these high functioning bankers that want nothing more than to just gain and continue to absorb power. It's not even necessarily about the money, it's what the money represents. It's their influence on history, on you and I. It's them absorbing our energy and our work, all of what we put into the economy. Meanwhile, they just suck all that up, print money whenever they want. It's their game. It's like we were born into this game of Monopoly. The bankers sit on the side and they get to change the rules whenever they want. And we essentially just accept it because we act like this is the only game that's possible. We act like history is just set and this is where we're at. And I think it's very important for the little guy or for people like you and me to be having these open conversations. I don't have all the solutions or the answers of how we're necessarily going to get out of this chaotic mess, but I don't think digging our head into the sand, getting uncomfortable, or not paying attention to this wealth transfer is doing us any good. They hide behind this veil of technical jargon, boring long drafts of information, banker lingo, and they make it seem like it's this incredibly complex space when in reality they have just built a complex system to essentially hide in plain sight this what I deem to be unethical and what should be illegal policy, economic and monetary policy changes. So I really do think that this is a crazy time to be alive. I think that, actually, if I could add one more, I believe that all that's happened in human beings is that the powers that be that used to own slaves essentially have just changed the chains that we are wrapped in. And instead of you actually being tied in as somebody that's not allowed to leave or somebody that's not allowed to do what you want within your day-to-day existence, they have just removed those physical shackles and instead shackled us in with a monetary system that taxes away your work, that can diminish your purchasing power with a quick flick of a pen and you have nothing to say about it, that keeps people trying to keep up with the Joneses and stuck in the rat race and kind of having their sights on just accumulating these fake dollars that don't actually represent energy or time or power, any of these tangible things, but are essentially this carrot on the end of the stick, keeping the common man just working, pursuing at least a little bit of a savings account so that they feel comfortable and not asking too many questions about what a healthy society would look like and what would be the medium of exchange or the store of value within that healthy society. So I think there's a lot of work to do, guys. If you have any questions, comments, concerns, if you can contribute, give me a little bit of feedback. I really would appreciate it. These are definitely tough monologues to kind of just think out loud. And if anybody could give me any help in having a bit of a discussion, I think that we could hopefully solidify some of these ideas together. So thanks for tuning into the podcast, and we'll do this again soon.